Hello, I'm David Cairns for Radio VR in Washington, and right now I'm speaking with Robert Parry, founder of consortiumnews.com. He's also been an investigative journalist with a large pedigree in uncovering Iran-Contra and other important features of the U.S. and world landscape. He's also been recently of real importance to many readers in dissecting some of the myths and some of the mischaracterizations, let's put it that way, about how the conflict in Ukraine has unfolded. His most recent look at the crisis is titled Ukraine's Dr. Strangelove Reality, which examines the persistent, recurring surfacing of neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine. We'll talk about that for a moment, and we'll go on to discuss some of the broader circumstances behind the conflict in Ukraine, not just a Russian-orchestrated revolt in eastern Ukraine, but really more serious and deep-seated issues that divide or threaten to divide Ukraine from its east, etc. Mr. Parry, let me turn it over to you and ask you what you're getting at when you highlight the reality, this persistent surfacing of neo-Nazi influence in Ukraine.
Well, it's certainly been an important part of the uprising that occurred in late last year, early this year, and then culminating in the coup on February 22nd. There were these far-right organizations, some organized under what's called the right sector, and this Robert Parry that has operated largely in western Ukraine, and they quite openly appeal back to their legacy of fascism and Nazism from World War II. They honor Stepan Bandera, who was a far-right nationalist who collaborated with the Nazis during World War II, and whose paramilitary organization was involved in the expulsion and killing of thousands of Jews and Poles during the war in the 1940s. So you have this history, and many of these very violent organizations have been able to develop and train people and put them in the field. They were sending in hundreds of these trained operatives into Kiev daily. In the period before the uprising. So you've had this element, which is quite ugly and which uses Nazi insignias. At one point, when they took over the city hall of Kiev, they hoisted the Confederate battle flag, the sort of universal symbol of white supremacy. And this has been an inconvenient truth that many of the people who did protest in the Maidan, who had obviously different political interests, have been trying to cover up, and frankly, what the U.S. government's been trying to cover up. The key role played by these groups, especially when the protests turned more violent and ultimately seized control of government buildings in mid-late February. So this organization, these groups have not disappeared. And they have continued to play a role in some of the violence. They, because of the key role they played in the overthrow of President Yanukovych, as there was an effort to cobble together a government that was not quite as extreme, they were given 4 ministries, including national security. And that has been a way for some of these groups then now to be incorporated into the National Guard. And into some of these police forces, and they're being sent to the front lines. According to the National Security Chief Parabouy, some of these folks were dispatched to eastern Ukraine to help put down the uprisings there. So, and some apparently appeared also in the recent tragedy in Odessa. So you have this element that is the most determined, the most violent of the pro-coup forces, and they continue to play a key role.
I think the stakes could be awfully high here. I'm grateful that you point out not only that these neo-Nazi elements played a role in the instance on Maidan Square, which drove out Yanukovych, but as well persist in the cabinet and persist on the scene in eastern Ukraine. I want to cite what I thought was a sober assessment from a professor in Norway named Floyd Rudman. Came out just a couple days ago on Common Dreams, titled The Crisis in Ukraine, What Can Be Done. He says the stakes are awfully high for two reasons. Number one, the Ukraine has 15 nuclear reactors. I don't need to elaborate on the dangers of what might happen there. Number two, he says the ability to start a war has now been distributed across hundreds of relatively low-ranked individuals on both sides. There are now hundreds of armed and ready military personnel on both sides, any one of whom, for any reason, can cross a border, shoot a missile, can start a war. In the Ukraine, large numbers of anti-Russian militia are eager to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine, and equal numbers of anti-Kiev militia are eager to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine. War now waits on hair triggers, hundreds of them. So we're talking about aggressive elements in Ukrainian political life right now, some of them neo-Nazis. And I don't want to belittle the danger here, that we're talking about the possibility of a war breaking out. Does it seem to you, therefore, that this Dr. Strangelove reality is a danger which will persist? And is there any hope that the West, the world community, will recognize it?
Well, I think it will persist. These groups seem to be very well organized and very determined. They are, in some ways, the most motivated in terms of the use of violence of any of the groups. And we've seen something comparable in a place like Syria, for instance, where you had a more moderate opposition to the Assad regime, but ultimately the most aggressive fighters against the Assad regime were the Islamists and some associated with Al-Qaeda. And so I think what you're seeing is the use of these very hardline people who are inclined to fight and eager to fight, now being necessary in a way by the current government, the interim government in Kiev, to defend itself and to go and battle the people who have risen up against the overthrow of Yanukovych. So I think yes, it will persist, and I think what this has done is also generate on the other side a feeling of anger, of being disenfranchised. Yanukovych had his political base in the eastern part of Ukraine. And once he was overthrown and once the constitutional process was violated, then people in other places who had their own interests and felt their interests were being trampled on, understandably resisted this. And because of the efforts to put down these takeovers of buildings in the east, in which the Kiev government termed these terrorists. They claim they were doing anti-terrorist operations. That only further feeds this fire of violence, because once people are deemed terrorists, that has certain implications in terms of how they're going to be approached. They're going to be essentially taken out and killed. So that makes people in those areas more inclined to get armed and to defend themselves.
I think it follows from what you're telling us that it would be a bit of a stretch to impose responsibility currently on the neo-Nazi elements in Ukrainian politics for the intransigence of the regime towards negotiating with the protesters in the East. In other words, if the entire government has already labeled them terrorists, has begun anti-terrorist operations, if they've already sort of drawn a line in the sand, they won't negotiate with them. It's really not the neo-Nazis in the cabinet or elsewhere that are driving that train, right? I mean, maybe they've set it up this way, but it's already out of the hands. It's not as though we can remove a couple of members from the cabinet as a gesture and all of a sudden find conciliation between the two sides. That the entire Kiev regime is at this point taking a stance which is intransigent. Have I got that right, or are we not sure?
Well, it seems that way. I would assume that there are some elements of the Kiev government who are less eager to see this thing boil up into a civil war than others. We've seen Prime Minister Yatsenyuk make some gestures toward reconciliation in saying that there will not be efforts to discriminate against people using the Russian language and so forth. But in terms of what they've articulated, it's all been pretty much from the same script, that these uprisings in the East have to be put down. But I'm sure there are gradations within any political coalition like there is now in Kiev, where some are harder line than others. Some really want this fight, and some may wish they could find a way to somehow reach some accommodation. The problem also has been, though, that in the United States, both the State Department and much of the mainstream media, I guess virtually the entire mainstream media, has been just pouring fuel on the fire, using the most extreme language, taking the most extreme interpretations of events, assuming, for instance, that the fighters in the East were simply Russian agents who had been slipped across the border to stir up trouble, rather than indigenous forces who have their own desires to control their destiny. So you've had this essentially false narrative that's been created in the United States, and that has further inflamed matters. To some degree, the EU has gone along with this. There's been a bit more nuance, I think, in the EU position than the U.S. position, but still, there's not been an effort to apply objective, even-handed analysis to the current crisis, at least not in Washington, D.C., where I operate.
You've just now, in some of your publications, helped us to dispel the notion that Russia is entirely orchestrating resistance in eastern Ukraine to Kiev. Pointed out that they have their own loyalties, identities, their own agenda. It's not just a question of being, in fact, it's not a question, as far as I can tell, of being anti-Ukrainian, but there are very serious economic and political issues which folks in eastern Ukraine wish to see represented. In other words, they elected Yanukovych. He's now gone. The current regime took steps to marginalize Russian language. They took steps to marginalize their elected institutions by appointing administrators to some regions in the East. And if you could finish off for us maybe with a couple words on the reality that Ukrainians are anticipating, I mean Ukrainians across the whole country, that there's going to be an IMF austerity plan, and economic hardships on the way, and that reorientation towards the West would only exacerbate the hardship by seizing up Ukrainians or severing their ties with Russia that so much of the Ukrainian economy depends on. Isn't it the case that there's an economic element that Ukraine is, in some sense, could be seen as a sinking ship, and that's part of the concern of not only Eastern Ukrainians but Ukrainians elsewhere?
Well, yes, I think what you've seen in Ukraine going back to 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union was the emergence or the use of what's known as shock therapy, this extreme free market capitalism, which was applied both to Russia and other parts of the old Soviet Union, including Ukraine. And that led to the emergence of a handful of oligarchs, 10 or 12 oligarchs in Ukraine, who are extremely rich and control a great deal of the wealth and therefore the political power as well. In Russia, that trend was interrupted by the rise of Vladimir Putin, who, for all the reasons you may criticize him, was also a strong leader and took on some of the oligarchs and tried to make the economic and political system of Russia work better for the country as a whole. That did not happen in Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons why there's this extraordinary corruption and why you have such widespread poverty and unemployment, whereas you have a handful of people who control so much of the wealth. Now, that has led to a lot of dissent, and understandably so, among the population. And when the EU dangled this idea that maybe Ukraine could become part of the EU in some way, they also raised those expectations probably too far. And that was followed by the IMF coming in and saying, well, as your first step, you're going to have to accept all these really harsh macroeconomic, quote, reforms, unquote, which means making the lives of the Ukrainians, the lives that are already very hard, even harder. And that was one of the reasons Yanukovych backed away from the deal with the EU. And as soon as the coup occurred and the Yatsenyuk government was put in, he was essentially handpicked by the Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland. And once one of the first things he did was to push through the IMF requirements, this harsh austerity program. So that's been a factor for some of the Ukrainians, especially in the east, who do not want to see this kind of harsh, even harsher life being foisted upon them. And as well, if they are cut off from Russia, which is their primary commercial partner, their lives will be even harder still. So there's some very logical reasons why people would rise up. And in fact, when there have been a few occasions where American journalists have done their job properly and gone in and actually interviewed people in eastern Ukraine, there was a piece in the Washington Post a month or so ago, and then there was a piece in the last few days in the New York Times. What the reporters found, was that there are these indigenous concerns, not that Moscow is pulling the strings, but that these people have real political grievances and real political and economic fears, and that's what's causing them to rise up. And I think understanding that should be a key element in how the U.S. and other governments deal with this crisis, rather than pretending that this is entirely a manufactured crisis brought on by Vladimir Putin, which it clearly isn't. Putin had very little to do with the actual crisis that emerged in February. He was tied up with the Sochi Olympics. Clearly, he was not a person who organized the Maidan demonstrations. He didn't organize the neo-Nazi militias that played such a key role. He didn't try to overthrow Yanukovych. He was supporting Yanukovych. So the idea that this crisis was something that Putin invented somehow is one of the more ludicrous conspiracy theories that is now very strong in Washington, D.C. I hear it from both people in the government and people in the punditry world.
Well, I think clearing up the misconceptions and the distorted narrative of the Ukraine crisis and Russia's role in it is of extreme importance now, given the stakes. We've been speaking with consortiumnews.com founder Robert Parry. I want to thank you for joining us, and hope you can help us clear this up as it develops.
Thanks, David.